So this is the third in our webinar series. And what I'm going to do is just sort of briefly recap without trying to be too repetitive or trying not to be too repetitive. Some of what we covered in the first two webinars before turning it over to Millie. And I'm really excited to be working with Millie as I was to work with Hiroko last time, because we've positioned trauma and violence informed approaches, or sometimes you'll hear me say trauma and violence informed care, as a very tailorable and adaptable approach to service delivery in various contexts. So it's really, really interesting to me to see how it's being applied to financial literacy education and financial literacy services. Next slide, please. So Millie and I are actually in very different parts of the country. So we have adopted SEED's wonderful land acknowledgement, which we present here. So we do respectfully acknowledge that we live and work on the territories and homeland of Indigenous peoples, and that the land and water sustain us. We respect the treaties as intended by Indigenous peoples. It's our responsibility to understand the truth of our history, be aware of the present, and work with Indigenous peoples to make positive changes for the future. In my own work, I try to reinforce this by ensuring that the research that I do and the way that I present the research does not perpetuate negative stereotypes about Indigenous people, and in fact takes a structural and collective approach to understanding the ongoing and historical impacts of trauma and violence. Next slide, please. So today's learning objectives are really to think about how to develop strategies to articulate the third and fourth principles of TVIC, which I'll review in a moment. So really to be strengths-based, person-centered, ideally actually person-led, in terms of identifying what people need in that moment and how best to get them on the next step of their journey, whether it's a financial literacy journey or their broader life life journey in a safe way. And that really requires listening and being collaborative in terms of discussing options and next steps. And towards the end, as always, we will provide you with links to additional resources on trauma and violence informed approaches and equity promoting practices. Next slide, please. I always start by reminding people that it's not complicated work, but it's hard work. And it's hard work because as we examine some of our previous practices and perhaps ongoing practices, and think about maybe what brought us into the work of supporting, in this case, women living on low income who really require financial empowerment. The ways that we're forced to work might not match with the values that brought us into the work, and this can be experienced as emotional labor. If we feel that our clients or those who are learning from us are being harmed by these processes, by policies, protocols, etc., this can even be experienced as moral distress. And that's something that we have to face and deal with. So trauma and violence informed approaches take that into account. They are disruptive because we do need to disrupt people's behaviors, and especially the behaviors of organizations and societies more broadly, so that we can promote change, but we have to keep people safe in that journey as well. So as you listen, you might be thinking, wow, you know what, the way that we've been told to do things maybe isn't the best way. That's okay. This is an opportunity now to reflect and to change, not to blame and shame. Next slide, please. So in the first couple of webinars, we really sort of delved into what we mean by trauma and violence informed approaches. And then in the second webinar, we looked more specifically at principles 1 and 2. So here are a few key points that I wanted to emphasize. So trauma is everywhere. Trauma, it's impactful, it's highly prevalent. In Canada, we know that up to 3/4 of the population have directly or indirectly experienced trauma that would meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress symptoms. And the way trauma presents in people's interactions can be quite different. And this is important because as an educator, what you see in the classroom or in a group setting or in a one-on-one situation might be quite different and might still be a trauma response. So anything from somebody becoming aggressive and defensive to somebody freezing or even leaving can be a trauma response. So that understanding is really important, as is the understanding that these are physiological responses. And there is a sort of gradation in terms of how severe and ongoing the trauma is, and how your physiology responds to that and the changes in your brain and your body. But that said, people will vary in terms of how they respond, and that is due to many different factors, including how how long the trauma has been going on, but also the sorts of social and other supports that they have in their environment. So how it presents is not up to you to dig into, but it is up to you to understand that it can be quite different, and to maybe, reframe what you're seeing as a trauma response rather than as somebody being difficult or non-compliant with the service that you're trying to give them. And really, we bring that V in to call it trauma and violence informed rather than trauma informed, to attend both to the specific harms of interpersonal violence. As Rebecca mentioned, I do research in the area of gender-based violence and violence against women, and especially intimate partner violence. So understanding the particular chronic and complex form of trauma that these represent, and the impacts on people's life and across their lifespan, but also the conditions of people's lives. And this is where we get into what we call structural violence. And these are things that are built into our policies, our practices, our society, and our beliefs and our norms that are harmful to people. And they can be changed because often they are choices. It's a policy choice to have minimum wage that is actually below what people can live on, especially in cities as inflation and rents keep going up and up. Discriminatory practices that are built into policies, systems, protocols, and our own implicit biases. These are things that cause ongoing harm to people in their everyday lives. And what we like to emphasize in a TVI approach is attention to those conditions of people's lives and what we as individuals and as organizations can do to mitigate those harms. We also position trauma and violence informed approaches, or trauma and violence informed care, as one aspect of what we call equity promoting or equity oriented care. And this is work that I briefly presented last time in our research program called Equip Healthcare. And I believe we will provide a link to that towards the end. So trauma and violence informed approaches are part and parcel with really taking an anti-oppressive, anti-racism lens, which we frame as cultural safety, providing a culture of safety when you're serving people, regardless of what culture they come from. Your culture is safe, your organizational culture is safe for them. And really focusing on mitigating the harms of stigma, especially substance use stigma. So this can be framed as harm reduction, but really trying to promote people's health and well-being, regardless of whether they're using substances as part of a trauma response or not. Next slide, please. So I told you about the 4 principles of TVIA or TVIC. Here they are here. I think the nice thing about these is they are highly adaptable, as I mentioned, to different circumstances. We've implemented trauma and violence informed approaches with police services, with healthcare settings, from primary care to emergency departments to Indigenous serving organizations, in education systems to create trauma and violence informed classrooms. So this is a set of principles based on decades of research that really can be applied in different contexts. And as I said before, what we really try to emphasize is a focus on structural and systemic forms of violence and actively countering discrimination and stigma. Next slide, please. So last time we talked about some strategies for enacting principles 1 and 2. So principle 1 is really about trauma awareness and strategies to build that into your organization and your individual providers or educators in this case. So that means providing opportunities for continuing professional development around trauma and violence, as well as looking at your space and ensuring that it is trauma aware. So we presented what we call a trauma review exercise and provided links to tools that would help you get started as an organization or a team to do that work. We also emphasized that you really need to consult with those that are using your services or taking your educational sessions, and those who deliver it on the ground that are closest to the work, to develop strategies to keep people safe. So that's the second principle, really is focused on cultural, physical, and emotional safety for people in the space, and that is both the providers and the recipients of service. And talk to people, what makes them feel unsafe, what makes them feel unwelcome. So that's an important piece. We talked a bit about language and really trying to avoid labeling or stigmatizing language. Language should be person first. So instead of saying something like abused woman, you might say a woman who's experiencing violence. And what that does is not put that heavy label on her as something that is part of her personality or part of her ongoing life. It says that experience can end, And hopefully soon she'll be a woman who's not experiencing violence. So we need to have our language be person first, non-labeling, and value their agency and the fact that you're seeing them at one point on a journey, and hopefully the next point, because you're intervening in a safe way, is a better point on that journey. And then importantly, as I mentioned, we need to keep the providers, the carers, the educators safe in all of this. So we attend as well to vicarious trauma, what that looks like, and how organizations can better support their workforce such that those who are providing the service are kept well and able to do their good work. Next slide, please. And then I was very lucky to work with Hiroko from Momentum in the last webinar. And this is a summary of some of the strategies that Hiroko presented. So really you want to create a welcoming, non-judgmental and inclusive learning environment. So think about how you're setting up your space, especially if you're in a third-party setting in a community center or something. What are the signs saying to people? How are the chairs set up to create that welcome, that safety? Make sure people know what the session is about and what to expect. So people who have experienced trauma, the feeling of not being certain what's going to happen next can be especially problematic. I say it's, that's problematic for all of us if we don't quite know what's happening next. But certainly when you've had experiences of not being in control and not having power, giving people at least the power to know what's happening next and what to expect is very important. And this might include things like co-developing plans and strategies with the people that you're educating and working with. Let people tell their stories the way that they need to do so to be safe. And don't expect them to tell their entire story. It's not up to you to dig around for disclosures of violence and trauma. What they're willing to share is what they need to share to get through that interaction and to get the service they need. And again, from an organizational perspective, you want to create a culture and an environment where there is reflective practice, where your workers, your providers, your educators are able to think about what they do to enhance their practice, to reflect with either a supervisor or a peer in a formal or informal way, such that they can continuously improve what they do, but also feel safe in doing that. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about this today, but find people's strengths. People will manage their money and their finances in different ways. Many people do the best they can in challenging circumstances. So let's celebrate that, find those strengths and build on them. So those were some of the points that Hiroko made today. And if we go to the next slide, I'm really excited that Millie is going to tell us a bit more about articulating strategies, principles 3 and 4. Millie.
Hi. Yes, I'm so excited to speak to or share with all of you SEED's approach in financial literacy. The piece about the work that I do in terms of partnership and building capacity outside of SEED. What you're going to see next is sort of the work that I do when partner organizations come to me and say, Millie, we want to embed the financial literacy training and do what you do and be that financial coach and support for our vulnerable population. So I'm excited to share with you our approach, and hopefully you do take some great learnings of this session. Next slide. So where to begin? The first thing that we talk about is actually the psychology of not having enough, also known as scarcity. And often when you think that, first of all, think about where people are at, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. That often helps you get grounded and prepared to have those conversations when it comes to money. Money is a stigma. People are uncomfortable speaking about it. And when you understand that they're coming in through the door with trauma, with some very difficult challenges, that's the first thing, is to be grounded and be ready to be responsive. Ultimately, there is a great book, as you see, Scarcity. It is a great read. Often we joke about it at SEED that if you work for SEED, it's a must read before you even begin. But it's got some great examples of the packing metaphor. And ultimately, when we work with our vulnerable populations, they're packing a lot more in a very small suitcase. Whereas we have others who may have more access to income or definitely have more assets, that their slack is a lot loose and have the ability to adapt. Whereas the folks that we work with at SEED, the slack is much less. And so looking at that point of view, when we do group-based training and strength-based training, it's really harnessing on those successes and the resiliency of our participants and feeding that into the experience in financial literacy. The next slide. often when people come to me, it's we want to learn about budgeting, and they often say it's about dollars and cents and mathematics, when in fact it isn't. Seed's approach in the beginning of our curriculum is ultimately about behavioral economics and some of the influences we make based on, or some of the decisions we make based on the influences around us. And so we really take a holistic approach in understanding where our participants are at in terms of their habits, the values in their lives, what peer pressure can impact money decisions, and ultimately family risk and consequences and advertising. It's a deeper dive and conversation in these areas before we even begin to talk about the strategies in gathering information and creating a budget. So I love to see when facilitators come through and they're like, yes, that's exactly what we need to hear, because there's this pressure to be a financial advisor, when in fact it's not. The first thing is empathy and understanding where our participants are at. And ultimately, it's understanding these influences in their lives. And I really see the growth in our participants when they are ready to share this information during the second or third class of our curriculum. Next stage, please, or next slide. So part of the work at Seed is we've actually used the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework as a way to design our programs and services. And ultimately, this was a research project by the Canadian Women's Foundation, also in partnership with Economos, where they followed women for over 5 years. And they discovered that women were faced with 6 stages in their lives. From left to right here, you're seeing on stage 1, it is where it's in crisis mode, right? So they're seeing depleting assets. They're really trying to focus on coping in their situation and maybe struggling in finding how to meet basic needs. And then what happens in stage 2 is that they're ready to connect. They're looking for resources to support them through the challenges that they're facing. And that's where I feel Seed has now, I'll be sharing the programs that we offer, but we've designed our programs to meet at every stage on this framework. Ultimately, it is our asset building programs that speak to the foundation of building foundations, where it's trying to find a solid base for stability, trying to find ways to build capacity, not only in financial management, but skill building and confidence, and creating relationships, safe relationships. And then ultimately going to future mode, where they start to transition and there's some behavioral change. They're taking the tools and the resources that we offer and implementing in their lives, practicing, continuing to talk to us in terms of mentorship, and then ultimately going down to future mode, where they're thinking about how to continue to build more assets. How do I support my family, my children, future generations, so that they're better prepared for those life shocks that happen? As you can see in the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, it is a spiral lens, right? It's not linear, because it ultimately we want to recognize that lives can go back to stage 1 quite quickly. The pandemic really showed that in the work that we do at Seed. A lot of the folks that came through were thinking, wow, I never expected this. I wasn't prepared. And so ultimately, it's the financial literacy and the supports that Seed provided that spoke to each stage to give them that opportunity to bounce back and try to go back to stage 6. The bottom half of the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework is what I speak to when it comes to our service providers, is when they're in stage 1 to 3, we really need to focus on how we can help them really set them up for success. So we want to focus on the conditions for participation. And ultimately, that's what you heard on the previous slide, about ensuring it is a safe environment, and then finding ways to help them enhance their coping strategies. That often could be just making sure that they trust you. I find that speaking to someone when you're invited to do a budgeting workshop, there is a little bit of that shame or fear of not knowing enough to be a part of that group. When I delivered to second stage housing, they're really, women tend to, well, in any delivery, participants are really shy and won't speak about it. But after 2 or 3, once they see the guards go down the walls, because they're seeing they could trust you and talk freely, and there's that safe environment, you'll see that they'll begin to really listen and learn from each other in that group-based learning. And also, this is basically the logistics of making sure you find childcare, providing flexible workshop times, daytime, evening, weekends, ensuring that there's food. So that's one less thing that the participants have to worry about. Even transportation is another benefit to attending workshops. And then once they start to go into the stage 4 to 6, you find that they're focused on asset building strategies. So next slide. Our 5 pillars in the work that Seed does is in terms of our foundation for everything that we do at Seed. We have to incorporate our financial literacy and coaching. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But we also have our income boosting opportunities through tax filing and benefits all year round. So we offer that free all year round to help support people in finding different ways of increasing income. We also want to make sure our most vulnerable populations have further understanding or aware of where there are safe financial products. And in the savings and asset building, we ultimately want to help people go to that future mode and build their assets, whether it's relationships, physical assets, it could also it could be financial, but ultimately it's that personal confidence and skill building that we want to see happen within our participants. And then consumer protection. Often what I love to see that Seed does is we're often the voice and we like to help navigate the big systems. And at times when folks are living in scarcity, it is very intimidating to even fill out a form. And so to question, to perhaps advocate for themselves in certain situations, Seed is there to support in any way we can for consumer protection. Next slide, please. So here's a quick overview of Seed programs. If you ever get a chance to come and visit us in Winnipeg, I often joke that it looks small from the outside, but when you walk in, we're a series of hallways, often joked about like it's Narnia. You walk in through the doors and one section you see our asset building programs, and that's ultimately where you get our financial literacy workshops, our match savings programs, and so on. So all of that money management sort of support is in our asset building programs. Then in another hallway, we have our access to benefits work, also known as A to B. And that's where we help people file their taxes and see if they're eligible for any benefits, provincial or federally. And number one is our access to birth certificates or ID work. The amount of ID requests that we face is monumental. It's amazing to see. We cannot meet the demands at this point. So it's interesting that ID is a pivotal piece of an asset. It's their ID. It's something that opens the doors to other benefits and work. So business development services, also known as BDS here at Seed, they are wonderful in terms of starting, improving, or expanding a business. So for folks who dream of perhaps even they may have had a business, faced a life shock, and want to try again, that is where BDS can step in and do some business consulting one-on-one. And then our Recognition Counts program is a program that supports a newcomer. They have a profession in their home country. They come to Canada, and so they need a little bit of help to get that international designation to do that same profession here in Canada again. It's so difficult for a newcomer family to once become a nurse in their home country to do it here. The amount of costs that they have to face to do the recertification and yet still support their family settle into a new country. It is very challenging. So ultimately, the Recognition Counts program provides some flexible, cost-effective loans to help you get recertified, to get recognition. Next slide, please. So ultimately what you see on the left-hand side here is someone that walks in through the door. You've got someone who has perhaps challenging times to meet their basic needs. They may have some connections, but they're not sure where to begin. And they may actually be struggling to find a piece of belonging, their identity. Where we step in as service providers is in the middle, strategic interventions. It is perhaps where you work is employment supports, skill building. It could be resume, interviews, and so on. Or it could be a family resource center, a community organization that's there to listen, to support in ways that ultimately may be out of scope for you. So they help with food security, shelter, and just that one-to-one counseling that people need. And so once we have financial literacy or asset building programs looking at our income boosting strategies, we hope that on the right-hand side, you can see that their assets are building, right? Their map becomes stronger. And the hope is that they're further along that sustainable livelihoods framework. Reducing vulnerability and building capacity. Next slide. So I'm happy to share with you an expert of of the training that is received during our Train the Trainer. So folks, community organizations serving or any financial literacy provider can contact SEED for Train the Trainer. So the work that we do at SEED is a 3-day training session, and part of that is understanding the 7 principles of adult learning. Next slide. Often when, this is a really good reminder, I'm sure this is a lot of folks that are in the service area will hear this more than once, but adults must want to learn. Time and time again, SEED is approached by perhaps some agencies and some, this woman needs to take this course because this is important to them, and this will reunite them with their children. I mean, that just sounds like they're being forced to do this work. And so often when they come through the doors at SEED with that previous conversation of you must do this, we have that one-to-one conversation about what is it that you want to learn, and let's be responsive to the current needs you face instead of providing you with a certificate, right? So ultimately making sure that we're responsive to them, that participant-centered approach. Next slide. Adults will learn only what they feel they need to learn. So I cannot say this enough, where workshops are never delivered the same twice. We have a nice army of facilitators at SEED, but ultimately we have an agenda, we have all intention to cover a certain topic, but all of a sudden, an example here is I'm in second stage housing, a group of very resilient women. And I was there to talk about budgeting, but they wanted to learn more about bank accounts, how to be independent. They may have been coming out of a terrible toxic relationship. Like, how do we start over? Where do I begin? I threw that agenda out and started talking about access to banking. And so you have to be that responsive when they're saying this is all the questions, all the sort of side conversations, and just be prepared to pivot. I said that word, pivot. You say that so much in the pandemic, but that is exactly what it is. It's just being right in the moment. And because if that's what they want to learn, that's what they're going to hear, and it's going to stick, right? Next slide. Learn by doing. So such a visual world we live in, right? Everything's on screen, everything's on apps. We've got our smartphones, but yet pen to paper, right? Action is what really gets people to understand and practice some of the new learnings and teaching. So what you'll find in SEED's curriculum is that there is some group-based work, there is some individual work that is assigned so that that pen to paper, that typing, that action item is incorporated in their learning. Next slide. Adult learning focuses on problems, and the problems must be realistic. So what's wonderful about the curriculum here at SEED is that we definitely recognize that the folks we serve are definitely living on low levels of income. And so ultimately the examples we have in our curriculum show that. We want to do some realistic budgeting and real life situations if that's the case, and so that they can relate to it. And so we have curriculum that speaks to youth. We have curriculum that speaks to our Indigenous partnerships and communities. And ultimately, we just want to make sure that we're meeting participants where they're at. So it must be realistic. Next slide. Experience affects adult learning. Often when it comes to that stigma of money, there's something about the vulnerability of a facilitator. And so when I talk about building that relationship or partnership, it's that storytelling and really sharing those life experiences. And so it's not just the curriculum in the book, but it's really incorporating that informal sharing circle, let's say. You can do it virtually, you could do it in person. But when you have that or invite that space where people can share their stories, it's the experience is just much greater that way. Food and drink also helps. But in the end, most people remember how they feel coming out of a workshop versus what they've learned in that budgeting book. And so if you can somehow tie that in the experience in the financial literacy workshop, the information will be retained. So that's just something to think about. Sharing circle, just less of a what's the word, institutional feel when you're delivering workshops. You want to make it as comfortable as possible. Next slide. Adults learn best in an informal situation. I was just joking previously that I love the fact when you do virtual delivery, the cameo appearances of cats and dogs and whatever else. I even have my screaming children in the background sometimes. You know, it doesn't have to be formal, right? It is something that you can invite your partner in or your children into the learning experience. Putting that guard down is number one. And ultimately what happens is that I call it dating almost. They start to date you, they start to share some information. And that's when you can really start to go into the depth of what's happening and provide those supports that they need. So informal is ultimately really the best way to approach when it comes to financial literacy. Next. Do you ever I always joke about this because I reflect on my children, but ultimately, if people tell you what to do, it's harder to swallow, right? People don't want to be told what to do. People want the information and the resources and be empowered to make that choice. And so we always we always recommend to our partner organizations that you can't tell someone what to do or how to do it or how to budget, but in fact, to share the information. You know, if you want to use that app, you know, instead for budgeting, or want to use a calendar notebook, or maybe you want to try changing your expenses for a month, that's them coming up with that solution. We will provide those options, but empowering them to decide and taking the step to incorporating those learnings. So that's the number one. That's another thing where you never want to tell someone what to do with their money. They'll shut down quite quickly. And I think, is that the last slide? Perfect. Okay. So that was a quick reminder for facilitators and financial literacy workshops. But ultimately, what I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to do at Seed is building partnership and capacity building outside of Seed walls. So often we get requests, hey, Millie, can we do a budgeting workshop? Or, hey, can your team come out and talk about RESPs and such? But also we offer the training and the services outside. So next slide. Our approach to partnership and building capacity is ultimately number one, participant centered, but being tailored and thinking about each organization and partner individually. And so often we come up with very tailored approaches when it comes to partnership, whether it's just only technical assistance, or can it be only mentorship and support, or it could be duplicating the resource or the programs that Seed offers and embedding it into that organization. So on the next slide, I have a wonderful menu of options. That's our financial empowerment menu of options, where from top to bottom, Seed offers these services in terms of access to ID, our tax filing and benefit applications, our money management training, our match savings programs, and RESP enrollment. From left to right is a level of engagement. So now you're looking, I am now speaking to each community organization individually, going, what is it that your community needs? And what is your capacity as a service provider? So whether they just want to refer to Seed, or if they'd like to host a drop-in event, can't wait to share that information. And then, or they want to be trained and embed this information, or embed the programs within their organization. So that's the level of engagement. On the next slide, what is a drop-in day? This is a drop-in day. So we recognize that we want to meet people where they're at. And so partner organizations like Seed, Community Financial Counseling Services. In this slide, we have Service Canada. We've had CRA attend our drop-in events, and it's a one-stop shop. So participants can come into their community where they feel comfortable, safe, a trusted source, and they can come and do their drop-in event. They can get their IDs. They can sign up for taxes and benefits. Right there on the spot, can also get some financial literacy coaching. The next slide. So one thing I wanted to share here is that I know that our focus is women, but this is something that has ultimately grown bigger and I'm excited to share with you a program called Money Stories. Ultimately, we've taken this work and we are partnering up with First Nation communities all over Manitoba. And this is a success story with a youth participant. His name is Riley Nepanak. He took one of my budgeting classes, And then ultimately I thought, man, this guy, he's definitely got a spark in him. He wants to share his knowledge. And he went through the train the trainer at Seed. Now, fast forward, he has established a volunteer youth-led organization in Winnipeg, and he's doing a great community economic development and being a full 360 when he took the course, and now he's training Indigenous youth in the heart of the North End here. You may have known him too. He cycled all across Canada, from the west coast to the east to raise awareness for Indigenous youth and into Taskraw Cree Nation. So great advocate, great, and that all stemmed from attending a budgeting workshop. It's amazing. Next slide. And here, this is one thing that is near and dear to my heart is money stories. It is our money management training with an Indigenous lens. But it's not just money. We've incorporated cultural teachings. It's the reconnection of our youth, our Indigenous youth with their culture. Here is a picture of our most recent group of junior facilitators where they attended a sweat lodge, right? And so they're learning some land-based teachings. And the best feedback I had from the group is the ability to share this with their friends, their communities. And so, and you could see their confidence and belief in the financial literacy to share that and just come out little by little, just a bit more stronger in working through the challenges they face. So it's relationship building, it's capacity building, and it started from money management, financial literacy training. There you go. Wow, that was a lot. I'm going to turn it back to, it might just be Q&A at this point, but I'll leave it for Nadine to decide.
Great. Thanks so much, Millie. It is just amazing the work that Seed does and how well what Millie has just walked us through aligns with all 4 of our principles of TVIA. You know, and especially the fact that the organization structures those principles into its work, into all of those frameworks, and really a deep understanding of people's journeys and how to ensure that the services that are provided really reflect people's lived experiences. So, wow, I'm just blown away, Millie, by Seed's work. I just have a couple of quick slides before we turn to Q&A, sort of back down to the micro level. So again, I've sort of taken some examples from some of the work that we've done and some of the curriculum we've developed. But in that moment when you're, interacting with somebody and you're trying to put aside your judgment, for example, you're dealing here. This is a case from our curriculum with Elaine. Elaine's been using a lot of alcohol. As somebody who's trying to help Elaine manage her money, you might think, well, alcohol's expensive. If you're saying to Elaine that the response here on the left, that would not be trauma and violence informed. That would not be strengths-based. That would not give Millie agency and control. So what we're saying here is don't say what's in the pink bubble, say what's in the teal bubble. Thanks for telling me. That took a lot of courage. Besides using alcohol, what else have you done to help you cope? And can we maybe find an approach that manages your needs and your budget? It's just a reframing with fairly simple language to remove that stigma and so on. Next slide, please. And this is just very quickly, many of you, especially if you're dealing in the context of empowering women who've experienced financial hardship, a lot of them will have experienced or still be experiencing domestic violence. What we've done here is map a trauma and violence informed approach onto the World Health Organization's lives protocol, and just want to reinforce how well those things fit, how the principles really map onto listening, inquiring about needs, validating, enhancing safety, and providing support. And at the bottom here, I've just got, again, some rephrasing words you might use to reflect the principles in the way that you're interacting with women when you're providing financial literacy education. Next slide, please. And a lot of this work comes from this particular document that we created, which is how we can sort of translate research into something useful in the real world. And we'll just have the link here, and I think Alice will probably pop it in the chat because she's really good at doing that. But this synthesizes what we know from qualitative research that primarily is speaking with women about their experiences and really trying to look at that from a trauma and violence informed perspective and understand people's journeys, and again, develop that empathy. And as Millie said, that, you know, where we're at, meet people where they're at and really understand that. So those are just a few tools here. On this final slide, we've got our contact information and then some links to some of the other TVI resources, as well as SEED's amazing program and other financial resources.